If you're using Umbraco 13 plus and you're interested to learn how you can unit test the Umbraco specific parts of your code base, then this is an essential video to watch, I promise. Carry on watching and you're going to learn how to set up your unit test project. You're going to learn how to test your pages. You're going to learn how to mock Umbraco API calls, mock CMS data. Basically, you're going to learn everything you need in order to get amazing test coverage within your code base. So we're going to start off by looking at the setup. Right, so I've got my newly created Umbraco website open in Visual Studio, and the first thing we need to do is create a class library to store our unit test within. So if I go to project, if I go to add, if I go to new project, I can select class library. From this list, I'm going to find class library, click on next. I can give it a name, so I'm going to call it my tests, call it whatever you want to. Then if I click on next again, we can make sure that it's .NET 8. Then if I click on create, my project's going to be created. Now the next thing we need to do is add a reference from our web project and our class libraries onto the unit test project. So all I need to do is grab my website project, drag it onto my unit test project, and you can see that within my dependencies projects, I've got a project reference set up. So now I can access my controllers defined here within my unit test. The next step is for you to decide which testing framework that you want to make use of. Now when it comes to .NET, you have a bunch of options. You can use the Microsoft Test Framework, you can use NUnit, you can use XUnit. The choices are pretty good. Now for this video, I'm just going to pick NUnit because it's the one that I've been using for the longest. However, I said, pick the one which makes you happy. So just like everything else .NET, you'll be installing NUnit via NuGet. And unsurprisingly, the package you need to install is called NUnit. Now, installing NUnit on its own won't allow you to run and check the status of your tests inside of Visual Studio 2022. This is the reason why you'll also need to install the NUnit 3 test adapter. So you can see here, this is going to allow us to run our tests inside of Visual Studio. Lastly, you'll also need to make sure that you install the Microsoft Net test.sdk because this is going to add in the MS build targets required for building your test project as well. Now, after I've installed all of those packages, the first thing I do is typically create an empty vanilla unit test project just to make sure that everything's installed correctly. So if we quickly switch back to Visual Studio, you'll see that in my Solution Explorer here, I've got a class. Now within my class, you can see that I'm importing a using from NUnit framework. Now in order to make a class, a test class, we use the test fixture attribute. Later on, if you're doing any setup stuff, you'll use the setup attribute. And then in order to create a test, we'll use the test attribute. And you can tell that everything is set up because if you right click in Visual Studio, you should see this run test, debug tests. And if you're not seeing this, it's probably because you haven't installed those test runners. And if I just do a run tests, you'll see that within my test window here, everything's going to work. And I should see a failure because this is just going to throw an exception. Off we go. Boom. We can see that everything has worked as intended. So those three packages are going to allow you to run unit tests in Visual Studio. However, we'll also need to install a mocking framework. And we'll need this to be able to mock certain Umbraco dependencies so we can test things like controllers. So the most used mocking framework for .NET is mock. So just install a mock with MOQ. And the final package that I'm going to install for this video is Fluent Insertions. Now, I should definitely say that you don't have to install Fluent Insertions. It is a nice to have. Basically, it's going to give you a Fluent API, which means that when you actually write your unit tests and you're adding all of those checks, you can write the checks in an English case statement rather than more a code syntax. So basically, it just means that you can read your unit tests much easier using this API. So when it comes to creating tests within a .NET CMS project, the first type of test that you'll likely create will be page related. So this means you're going to need to know how to unit test controllers. Now, within Umbraco, they provide you with a handful of base controllers that will allow you to hook into different Umbraco-related events. Now, I've created a video all about Umbraco controllers, which you'll find in the related tutorial below, so I'm not going to cover them here. However, these controllers are the first thing that we need to master when it comes to unit testing Umbraco. So we're going to start the ball rolling by looking at render controller. Now, you can think of render controller as your go-to controller type that you use when you want to render a page from Umbraco CMS. Now you can see that if we jump into the code, render controller defines this constructor. So within this constructor, we need to pass in an iLogger, we need to pass in an iComposite engine, and we need to pass in an Umbraco context accessor. And if we go back and I delete this controller, you'll see that we're going to get an error, so this thing has to exist. Now, before moving on, I wanted to give a quick backwards compatibility note. So we're using Umbraco 13 in this video, and in the new world, since I think Umbraco 9 or 10, you always have to create controllers with this constructor and passing in these dependencies. Now, in previous versions, like really old versions, maybe 7 or 8, you could get away with just creating a controller without a constructor. However, this is no longer the case. So what this basically means is that before we can actually test a single thing, we're going to have to mock a bunch of stuff. So I've created a bunch of private fields here. You can see that I'm mocking the iLogger, I'm mocking the iComposite view engine, I'm mocking the iUmbraco context accessor, and then within my setup method here, which I've called init, and you can call whatever you want to, I'm just mocking up everything by newing it up here, and then eventually I'm creating my controller, and then I'm passing in all my mocks. And the key thing here is I'm doing this dot object and everything, because this is actually going to give in the mocked object to our controller. And with all of this stuff done, we're now ready to actually start writing a unit test. So now I've jumped back to my controller, and you can see that within my controller, I've created this very simple index method. So to keep this test simple, we're going to start off with a very simple index action. So you can see that we're going to pass back an iAction result. The name is called index, so this is going to be the default controller, and then in it I'm passing back a view, and I'm just going to new up this view model here. Now if I click on it, you can see my view model is very simple. It's just a poco in this example. I've called it my view model. It's got one bit of data. I'm not going to bother setting it. Now what will probably happen in the real world is your index is probably going to be more likely to look a bit like this, where within your code you might be using Umbraco model builder, so you need to get access to the content model. You can then potentially build up your view model based on that data using something like a service or within a different class, or if you want to, you might build it within the action itself. Then when you have a view model that you're happy with that contains all the data required by the page, you can then return your view, you can set the specific view that you'd like to load and pass down that view model into that view. Simple. So if we switch back to my class, the first thing we can do is define our class method. Now the way that we test controllers is kind of awkward. So once we've got our controller spun up, which we did in our setup, remember, what we can do is controller and then call the method we want to call, index. Now in this example, in my index method, I'm not passing in anything here. Potentially you might be in your code. However, for mine, I'm not. Now the weird thing here is that you need to type the result from your index as a view result. So you can see here that we're returning this iAction result object. Now when it comes to a controller, you'll be capturing this view result here. Now once we've got our results, you can see that we can do this result.model. Now this model here is now going to return the model that we've added. So this is basically referring to the thing that we passed in here is the thing that we need to type here. And then finally, you can see that I can use my fluent assertions. Now I'm saying that my model should not be null. So following on from this, if I now debug that code, I'd get access to my view model, and this is going to allow you to do the majority of your controller testing. So when it comes to testing controllers in Umbraco, a few things I recommend is remember you'll be returning an iAction result, but you need to type it to a view result in order to get your view model. Now another tip is that I always try to keep my controllers light. And by this, I mean that all the code that I need to write in order to build up my view models, to get data, I'll typically put that in a service and then call that service from my controller. Now, the reason for this is that separating your controller and your custom code into two different classes will make your unit tests easier. And when you try and mix and match your code and your controller logic into the same file, it just means that your unit test project is going to be a little bit harder. So you didn't have to follow this, but from my experience, this will make your unit testing life a lot easier. So that covered the mechanics of how you could start writing unit tests for page controllers, and things are pretty similar if you want to use the other Umbraco controller types. Now, quickly, let's have a look at how we test an Umbraco API controller. Now, the first thing I'll say is that yes, we're using .NET 8, and in .NET 8 applications, we do have minimal API. However, if you're building an API inside of your Umbraco web solution, you're going to have to use the classic way for the time being. So Umbraco API controller here, I've got two examples. So one action, one index, which is called example1, and the other action, which is called example2. This just returns a string. This returns some JSON. So within my unit test project, I've created a brand new file, which is my API controller tests. Now, because we're using the API controller, we don't actually need to pass in any dependencies here. So to spin up our setup, our init, is very simple. It's just creating our new controller. And in order to access or test our data, you can see here I can just do my controller, and then I can call the action, the index that I want to use. This is going to return the string, because remember, within my declaration here, I'm just saying example1 is going to return a string, and then I can use my fluent assertions to say result should be hello. Simple. Now, in the second example, because I'm returning a JSON, you can see that I've got an HTTP GET here. I'm returning a JSON result. I'm using the new .NET 8 inline array feature here to define my array. Look into that if you didn't know what I'm talking about. And then you can see here that I'm just doing a new JSON result, passing in my string array. And in order to access this, I can call the example2 action. Then in order to get the data, I can do .value. Then using JSON convert, I can convert all this information into my string, and then I can just do a comparison. Remember, I need to escape out my JSON here. And as you can see, both these tests are running successfully and passing. The final type of controller I'm going to pick on before we move on to the next section is Surface Controller. Now, the reason why I'm picking on Surface Controller is because it will allow you to process postbacks. Yep, so basically whenever you need to create a page with an inquiry form, a comment form, whatever it might be, and you want users to submit data which gets sent back to your application for you to process, you're going to be inheriting from the Surface Controller type rather than the regular render controller. Now, the Surface Controller does take a lot of inputs for the constructor. So you can see here we're passing in a context accessor, a database factory, the service context, app caches, a profiling logger, and a published URL provider. So yep, this means that our setup is going to be a little bit more involved. So let's look at that quickly. Now, in order to test this controller, you can see that I've created a new file, called it my Surface Controller test. Now, the setup here is quite involved. Now, in this example, I provided you with a bit more of a shortcut syntax on how we can new up this controller. So instead of doing all those private fields and then using the .object, instead you can use mock of pass the interface in directly, and this is doing an equivalent thing. Now, the only limit with this is that you won't be able to update or change the object being passed in here. However, the trade-off is much easier to create syntax. Now, when it comes to passing in dependencies, if we click on service context here, you can see that it doesn't work to an interface, so you're going to have to pass it in directly. Also, app caches, again, doesn't work to an interface, so you're probably not going to mock this one. Aside from that, though, this is fairly simple. So with that setup now covered, let's look at how we can test an action. So on the screen, hopefully you can see I've got this submit action. Now, it's got an HTTP post at the top. Again, it's returning an iAction result. Now, the name can be anything you want. I'm going to call it submit because, that makes sense. And in our method, we're going to be returning content. So I'm using this content overload and just passing back this string, jobs a good one. Now, when it comes to setting up this test, you can see that I call up my controller. I'm calling the action submit. Now, because we're using this iAction result, we need to type it here. So we're going to return this content result. Because we can do that, I can now do a result should not be null. I can also access the content property, and this is where this returned hello is going to be included. See there, it's in content. And then I can use my Fluent API to say content should be hello. And then if I click on this and do a run test, you will see that it's going to run, and then this is going to go green. Job's good, and we've set up a basic test with a Surface controller. Now that we have a way to unit test our pages, we need to think about how we can unit test our CMS data. Now, obviously, when data lives in a CMS that can be updated, we can't hard code values in our unit tests, because if someone updated the CMS, our unit test will break. This means that when it comes to testing data in the CMS, you'll be using mocking. Now, if you're using Umbraco, a good practice when it comes to working with your document types is to use the Umbraco model builder. So in this section, we're going to focus on how can we unit test the models created by Umbraco model builder. Now, because we're focusing on unit tests, I'm not going to explain what models builder is. However, a quick overview is that in Umbraco, you'll create document types. You can see here, we've got this my document type. Then if we go to the settings page here, you can see that we've got this models builder. So if we click on models builder, we've got the possibility to generate models. Now within C# itself, you can see that we've got some config in our app settings.json where we can set things to say source code manual. We can say that we're going to publish our models within this Umbraco's model directory. And then if I open this up, and if I look within my Umbraco models, you can see here that we've got a bunch of classes, and these classes are going to represent the things that we create in Umbraco. So our aim here is to be able to unit test this my Umbraco content type. So the example I want to walk you through here is how we can test a view model. Now I'm using the .NET 8 primary constructor here, and you can see that in my constructor argument, I'm passing in my Umbraco models builder type here. And then all I'm doing is mapping the prop here as a public property within my view model. So the test that I'd like to write is I want to make sure that this data here is being returned correctly from this public property here. Now this is definitely easier said than done. So the first thing you might consider is maybe we could mock our my document type. So you can see here I've got an example of me trying to mock it. And if we step through my code, what we'll see is that when we try and access the object, we're going to get this error. Cannot instantiate proxy of class. Now the reason we get this error, if you look within the object, you'll see that it has a constructor and it needs to pass in this iPublished content and this iPublished value fallback. So this means that when it comes to testing this my document type, we're going to have to work with the concrete class, and then we're going to have to pass in mock dependencies instead. Okay, so this is where things get a little bit tricky, so keep your hats on. So on line 21 here, you can see that I'm spinning up my new my document type object. And I'm doing that by mocking a iPublished value fallback, and then I'm also passing in a mocked published content. Now, if we want to test data being returned from the CMS, it's this iPublished content thing that we're going to have to work with. Now, in order to actually test and mock data, you're going to have to create an iPublished property. So basically every single property that you want to work with, you're going to have to create something which looks like this. And in essence, what I'm doing is creating a new mock of iPublished property. Then for the alias, I'm going to return the alias name that I want to work with. Then when it says a get value, you can see here that I can pass in the culture and the segment. Now, when it comes to testing this stuff, I don't really care because I just want to get some data being returned. So when you're working with mock data and you don't really care about the values being passed in, this is where you can use it.isAny. Then you just put in the type that you want to work with. So this means that when get value is called, regardless of the culture and the segment being passed in, it's going to be returned this value here. Then finally, within my mocked published content, what I can do is a setup. Then I can say when I do a get property and the value is prop, I'm going to return my property object. Now, the reason why I'm doing small case prop here is that if I look in my document type here, and then I go to my prop value, you can see here that the implemented property type, you can see it's a lowercase prop here, and we've got the value lowercase prop here. So hopefully this was a bit of a long-winded way of setting things up. However, you can see that in order to test that content model created by Umbraco, we work with the iPublish content. For each property that you want to return data, you'll create an iPublish property. Then on the published content mock itself, you're going to do a setup. You're going to use the name which you'll find within the document type itself, and then you're going to return that property. And with the setup all said and done, I can now pass in my type into the constructor of my view model. Then when we walk everything through, you'll see that this is getting assigned. You can see that my mock prop here has now got that value that we set it. And this means that when we do view model prop, it should be value 1. This is going to pass. And this is how you can simulate and mock your CMS data that's being imported using Umbraco Model Builder within your unit test. Now, granted, the setup is a bit of a faff. It does take you a while to get your head around what you need to do. However, with a bit of persistence, you can get there and you can get some great test coverage around your view models, your controllers, and basically anything where you're interacting with the Umbraco CMS. You now know how to run tests in your controllers. You know how to mock the data being returned from the CMS. The final Umbraco specific unit testing thing that you probably need to know about is how do you actually mock the APIs? So how do you query Umbraco and return data? Well, the good news is that over the years, Umbraco has been working towards interfaces. This means it's pretty easy to mock the majority of Umbraco APIs that you need to work with. So let's look at this at a code level. So I'd say that for the majority of the part, if you want to mock Umbraco helpers, the things you'll need to mock are the iUmbraco context accessor, the iUmbraco context, and iPublish content. And you can see all of these, they work to interfaces, so mocking them is pretty easy. The only thing that you might want to use that doesn't work to an interface, so you can click on this, you can see no interface here, is the Umbraco helper. So Umbraco helper has a bunch of stuff in here that's pretty useful for you. You can see that we've got things like get content, we can get content by XPath, we can get media, there's a bunch of stuff. So when it comes to the Umbraco helper, you can see that we can create and mock it by using the concrete class and then passing in an iCulture dictionary factory, an iUmbraco component renderer, and an iPublished content query. Now, I'm not going to give you an Umbraco history lesson here. Umbraco helper has been around for ages. It doesn't work to an interface. However, the majority of things that you probably want to do with Umbraco helper, you can do with some of the more modern APIs that have been written to an interface. So let's say next that we want to write a unit test that mocks querying the CMS and returns some data based on a page ID. Now, in order to do this, we're going to be working with the iPublish content type again. So this is key when we're working with any type of CMS data. And in order to query the CMS, we can use the iUmbraco context. Again, we need to mock it. So in order to query by ID, we can do a setup. Then we can do an x.content, and this is going to point to the front-end content cache. Then we can do get by ID, and then this ID 1 here that I'm passing in, this is going to be related to the page ID that gets created within the CMS when you create a page. Now, when it comes to returning data, we can just use .returns, and then I'm passing back this mock object here. And if you remember in our previous example, it's also possible to use the iPublished property, add these to your iPublish content so you can mock all of this to your heart's content. Now, when it comes to actually looking at our test, if I step through my code, you can see that in my Umbraco context objects, I'm doing my content get by ID simulation here. This is now mocking my CMS content call. You can see here that in data, I'm getting returned this mock object. So now I can write unit tests that actually query the Umbraco API. Whew. Well, if you're still watching this, I can't ask much more. Now, granted, unit testing is a massive topic and I can't cover every single nuance use case in this video. However, using the tools and techniques that we've covered so far, you do know everything you need in order to unit test pretty much anything in Umbraco and get great test coverage. Now, before we part ways, then there are a few things. If you are interested in learning more about Umbraco, I'm currently doing an Umbraco 13 series. I release a video every Sunday. Hit subscribe if you haven't. If you have got value from this video, then click on like. If you haven't liked this video, don't just put your thumbs down. Instead, tell me in the comments what you think I could improve, because I really do appreciate the feedback. Now, I do a free Sunday newsletter, and along with the related tutorial from this video, just look in the description, it's all linked there. It's all good stuff. And if you do want to learn more about Umbraco 13, then on the screen right now, there's a feature tour to Umbraco 13. So click on that to learn more. Otherwise, until next Sunday, happy coding.